Okay, welcome everybody, near and far. More far than near, but here, this is the first in-person seminar of the semester. We're very pleased to have that sense of semi-normality, although the hybrid form has the advantage of giving us a global audience. So we did learn something in the pandemic. It's kind of this sort of meritocratic. We're trying to do some learning during this whole pandemic situation. So I'm very pleased indeed to welcome our speaker, Professor Kenneth. And he's a friend of the center. This is his second talk here. And due to popular demand, he's come by for a second time. But now, happily, he's a neighbor. He's teaches at nearby Baptist University, which is, along with us, surely the two best universities in Kalimantan, I think.
The only two.
It's fair to say.
In that class. Yeah.
And Kenneth was recruited in the Talent 100 initiative in Baptist U and has joined there just in February of this year, in somewhat inauspicious time, but has made it through the pandemic along with the rest of us. He was previously Associate Professor and Vice Dean at the National University of Singapore's Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. His books include Singapore Identity, Brand and Power, which was published by Cambridge University Press in 2018, Governing the Global City Singapore, Legacies and Futures After Lee Kuan Yew, very timely book published by Routledge in 2017, and Cinema, Television in Singapore, Resistance in One Dimension, Brill 2008, to mention one more, Renaissance Singapore, Economy, Culture and Politics, and US Press 2007. So Kenneth, thanks again for coming back. We welcome everybody in our cloud here, the global audience, large. We're pleased to see it's a global audience. And we look forward to your talk, Kenneth, and then our Q&A afterwards.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I'm not sure if people can hear me. They can, I presume. And can see the slides. Yes? Okay, so thank you very much, Mark, and it's such a pleasure to be here. And you're right, I was here before 2 years ago. And if memory serves me, I think on that occasion I spoke about pragmatism in Singapore, and I described pragmatism at that time as a very generative, productive and liberating practical philosophy that served Singapore well, but after the 1990s started to harden up into something much more dogmatic. I guess in a way you could think of it as pragmatism turning into a fig leaf to conceal, barely conceal, the slightly embarrassing nakedness of capitalism that Singapore had embraced. And I described that capitalism in terms of neoliberal globalization. And I think I suggested at that time that it was a sign of, that Singapore's finest years were coming to an end. And it's been 2 years now, and I feel a lot more confident to write a book about decadence in Singapore. And that's really a project that I'm about to start, a book that I want to title tentatively Neoliberal Decadence in Global City Singapore. And my talk today will be on a possible chapter in that book, which is on meritocracy. And I've been working on meritocracy for some time now, beginning with this chapter, this journal article in 2008. I want to outline a little bit this journal article, and then say a little bit about how my thinking has evolved since that time. So in that journal article, I described meritocracy as a very baggy concept, a concept that was able to contain a number of components that were in and of themselves not necessarily bad things, right? They're possibly good things, but they didn't necessarily cohere very well. Some of them were even contradictory. But the great power of meritocracy was its practical, pragmatic ability to contain these components. So the components were non-discrimination, opportunity, allocative efficiency, competitiveness, and reward. And in that article, I aligned these components with certain precepts of Singapore's developmental experience. I thought that these components align quite nicely with them. For example, the idea of multiracialism aligned with non-discrimination, the notion of personal responsibility, self-reliance, even rugged individualism seem to align quite well with the idea of opportunity. Scarcity in the early years of independence also aligned with the need to allocate scarce resources in the most efficient manner possible. Social mobility, that sense of being able to progress individually as well as a nation, was also compatible with this idea of competitiveness. And then especially towards the 80s and 90s, the notion that an upgraded economy would rely on talent, right, was also compatible with the meritocratic notion of reward. And in that paper, I also aligned these developmental precepts and components of meritocracy with particular institutions that you would readily find in Singapore. The idea of multiracialism as a kind of pluralist construct rather than a national integrationist construct. Individual responsibility and a minimal welfare state, which at the time was designed in order to minimize what were thought to be negative or perverse incentives, but also to reduce the burden on national finances or the burden on future generations. So that was the thinking at the time. Right? Also an education system that would allow for the best use of human resources, that it would give everyone a chance. It would stream people into different areas where they could excel and contribute. And an education system that eventually was assessed internationally to be of higher quality. And then a system of public sector scholarships, prestigious scholarships, which would identify the most able students, send them off to top universities overseas, bring them back and give them career opportunities in the public sector, where they would excel in fast track opportunities. And Singapore would benefit from these scholarships. And then finally, salaries. Since the mid-1990s, the idea that you had to pay really high private sector-like salaries to your public service leaders and political leaders in order to be able to attract the most talented Singaporeans into an area that is that does not necessarily enjoy prestige, the public sector. So all these things sort of work together very neatly and very effectively. And I sort of suggested in that paper that it was probably one of the factors that led to Singapore's success, well-documented success. And one of the reasons for that was that it was able to pragmatically deal with features that you would find naturally, or that you would more naturally be able to align with the ideological left, with those features that you would be able to align more naturally with the ideological right. So this is some kind of productive pragmatism in this constellation of institutions, values, and components of a very baggy concept. But I argued in that paper also that from the 90s onwards, Singapore started to embrace the precepts of neoliberal globalization a lot more tightly. And as a result of that, we saw the meritocratic concept itself from a baggy concept, tighten up and shift to the right. So we began to pay less attention, I think, to the more egalitarian components on the left of the spectrum. And we started to pay a lot more attention to the components on the right, things like rewarding success, the importance of competitiveness, and paying attention to the elite, cultivating an elite. And by doing that, you generate wealth, success that would trickle down to the rest. And so the thinking started to shift in that direction. And there was a lot more tolerance, I think, of inequality and poverty as a result of that. So I argued in that paper that what historically might have begun as a meritocratic principle of governance turned very profoundly into elitism from the 1990s onwards. So it was a narrative of degeneration. But the weakness of that paper, I think, was that I didn't clearly enough identify the different types of criticisms of meritocracy. And since that time, there's been a lot more work done on Singapore's meritocracy, so a lot more criticism of meritocracy. And so what I'd like to do, I think, is to try and disentangle all these different criticisms and to better understand what people might mean when they criticize meritocracy. What specifically do they not like about it? And it seems to me that one way to do this might be to use an analogy of the machine, right? So if meritocracy were like a machine, then one set of criticisms might involve thinking of the machine as an acceptable thing, maybe even a good thing, but that certain parts in this machine may be harmful. They may be defective, objectionable. And then if you think that way, then one solution might be to replace some of these parts or to remove some of these parts, but meritocracy itself is still a worthy system to embrace. A second type of criticism may also accept the machine, find the machine desirable, but consider that different parts of this machine may not work together so well. They may be incompatible. So the machine might work on the whole, but after a while, the different parts will start to jam into each other, and which leads to malfunction, right? So there's a certain kind of incompatibility. The third type of criticism looks at the design of the machine and says, this is a well-designed machine, right? On paper, it looks terrific, perfect, in fact. But the moment you switch it on, it doesn't work, right? So it works in theory, but the practice just doesn't deliver the kinds of results that you expect. The fourth type of criticism looks at this machine, this meritocratic machine, as producing outputs that give you pleasure, give you sort of fantasies and visions of enjoyment and success and all of that. But actually, these are fantasies that obscure the problems in the machine itself. So, you could think of this as a fantasy-producing machine, right? And the fifth type of criticism looks at the machine as something that worked well for a long time and now is not working as well as it did before. It may even collapse, right, at some point. So the first type of criticism is that there are objectionable parts in meritocracy. The second says that there are internal contradictions in meritocracy. The third says that meritocracy, the practice of meritocracy doesn't live up to the theory. The fourth thinks of meritocracy as an ideology that disguises its internal contradictions, its exploitations, and its injustices. And the fifth, and the one that I'm most interested in for this book that I'm going to write, is meritocracy as a narrative of degeneration or a narrative of decay. So let's, if I can, let me talk about each of these, just to give you a sense of the concrete criticisms that are made under these categories. So what are some of the harmful parts of this otherwise acceptable piece of machinery called meritocracy? Well, three of them might be merit, first of all. Secondly, competitiveness, and third, reward. Right? So what's wrong with merit? Well, the usual kind of criticism about merit is what is merit, right? What defines merit? And then who defines it? And then what sort of indicators can you point to which can reliably tell you something about merit and the meritorious? And usually the answers to these questions lead to the conclusion that, well, merit is what the meritorious say it is, right? The winners get to say what winning looks like. And as a result of that, they control the rules of the game. And by controlling the rules of the game, they get to exclude those who are not part of the gang, and they get to include those who look and speak and think like themselves. So there's kind of elitist conclusion to this set of questions. The idea of merit also, or the problem with merit also, is when it is narrowed down to very few indicators or a very narrow set of parameters. And what this does is it reduces diversity, multiple perspectives, multiple frameworks of evaluation to a one-dimensional society, right? And the problem with this, according to this argument, is that it goes against what you need for innovation. It goes against what you need for a robust system. It goes against what you need for resilience, right? And if we're going into a world that's understood to be more complex and more volatile and so on, then being one-dimensional is going to make it very brittle and risky. So merit could be a problem when it's seen in these ways. Secondly, competitiveness, right? So what's wrong with competitiveness? I suppose in moderation, most would agree that there's nothing inherently wrong with competitiveness, but when it's taken to extremes, as people often say it has in Singapore, competitiveness then hyper-individualizes a society. So people become isolated into individuals. Success is individualized. So you think of your success as purely your own effort, and you think of people's failures as purely as a result of their own lack of effort, right? And it reduces the sensitivity to structures, especially hidden structures in society that may account for why people succeed and why people fail. So there's hyper-individualization of prospects. And also the sociological sense in which people are individualized, and therefore the reduction of the possibility for collaboration, community, having a sense of responsibility for one another, moral solidarities, right? The possibility of these kinds of things severely reduced when we go the individualization way. Another type of criticism has to do with how meritocracy leads to hyper-competitiveness, and hyper-competitiveness has an impact on the quality of life, right? So the quality of life, we've seen that Singapore has had to deal with the problem of mental health, depression, suicide rates. It's become a lot more public in recent years, but also that sense in which the quality of life, the stress of living in Singapore, the hyper-competitiveness affects society. What's that term they use? Lifestyle impotency, right? So, and that relates somehow to the problem, a post-familial society and the sort of birth rate problem associated with that. And Singapore struggles with its birth rate. It's one of the lowest birth rates in the world. And if nothing changes, it will be unable to reproduce itself biologically. So there's that type of criticism as well. And finally, reward, right? Usually this criticism has to do with how a focus on reward, especially extrinsic aspects of reward, can degrade things like public service. You can produce leaders who feel very entitled, right? The more you reward them and the more you flatter them with reward, the more they expect more reward. You also, at least in the Singapore context, and the way that Singapore designs its top public sector and political salaries, the salaries themselves are pegged to the highest earning people in society. So I think the original formulation was something like the salaries are pegged to 2/3 the median salary of the top 8 earners of the top 6 professions in Singapore. What that does, of course, is to incentivize top public sector leaders and political leaders to maximize their own salaries by paying the most attention to the salaries of the elite in society. Does this mean everybody is going to only focus on the elite and forget about the poor and the middle class? Of course not. But the incentives are designed so that they would pay most attention to the upper reaches of the economy and society. So these seem to me to be the main criticisms that point to particular aspects of meritocracy as debased. Now the incompatible parts, the internal contradictions, right? One type of criticism has to do with the contradiction between paying attention to starting points, the egalitarian starting points, equality of opportunity, versus paying attention to the results, the end point, right? So if you think of a race, it's like, do you say, let's prepare everyone well, train everyone well, give them all the resources so that they can run a fair race and everybody has a good chance of winning this race? Do you pay attention to that aspect? Or do you pay attention to the end and say, forget about everything at the beginning, let's just see who gets across that final line, right? And give a high enough reward so that people will run their fastest race, and we just pick the winners. And so, you have this sort of tension between thinking about, one way of thinking about this is the process, whether the process is just and fair, reasonable, or just saying none of that matters at all. The only thing we care about is the results, the outcome. That is a pragmatic approach to it, right? So we just pick winners. If you can balance these two things, as meritocracy, I think, has done in the past, that's great. But the moment you start to swing to away from egalitarian concerns to elitist reward concerns, then you're going to have, a shrinking of welfare, a social disinvestment. You're going to have a lot of attention paid to motivating the winners, incentivizing and compensating the winners, and not paying enough attention to those who may be very able, capable, and potential winners, but for all kinds of structural reasons of unfairness and justice, were not able to run the race in a fair enough way. So that's one sort of problem, right? Now, if you forget about that endpoint problem and just focus on the starting points, egalitarian principles, even within that space, you have contradiction and tension between, for instance, saying, as we often do with meritocracy, that we should be colorblind, right? The non-discrimination principle, we should be colorblind. But in multicultural settings, which is, I suppose, every setting, right? If you were really colorblind, you might also be blind to the very real structures of disadvantage that people in the minority might face. So saying that we treat everyone as, we don't look at their race, we don't look at their gender, we don't look at their sexuality, we don't look at their age, could mean that we are ignoring the very real barriers that different groups have to overcome and other groups don't have to, right? So it could well be that meritocracy requires discrimination and identifying the hidden structural disadvantages and inequalities that different groups face. Now, this is very easy to say in theory, but in practice, it's notoriously difficult to implement, right? What do you do, especially when we fold into this account the notion of intersectionality, right? Where it's not just about a disadvantaged minority versus race versus majority race, you're also talking about the very real possibility that there are people in the minority who may enjoy lots of advantages by virtue of the wealth that they happen to have or the connections that they happen to have. And so when you factor in the intersectionality, it becomes very, very difficult to figure out how to correct for structural inequality. What more if there's also intercultural fluidity where you're not locked into any particular identity. It becomes notoriously difficult to correct for structural inequality. So there's that type of criticism. And then finally, this notion of scarcity versus competition. So intuitively, if you say we don't have enough resources, human resources, we don't have enough talent, well, intuitively to say that if you make them compete, they will perform better than they otherwise would. There's something attractive about that idea. But we also know that when this is extended, you end up with wasteful duplication, people doing the same things, competing for the same goals, because what counts as merit has been narrowed, right? So people doing the same things, and some will win, some will lose, and you've wasted those who have lost. At the same time also, because of the stringent sorting system that meritocracy tends to be in places like Singapore, the focus is always on the number one, right? So the number 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, they're all losers in systems like this. And when you have people who are perfectly capable and very talented and winning may be very marginal, right? You end up wasting a whole lot of people who are demotivated because you've just consigned them into the loser category, right? And once you've and they may stay in the system and be demotivated, be demoralized, they may simply give up and not contribute anymore. Or if they continue to want to contribute, they may just flow out of the system, flow out of the country and do well in other places. So meritocracy in this sort of way can have an even more adverse effect on the scarcity problem. Okay, so here's the third type of criticism, which is that the design of meritocracy is fine, but it doesn't seem to work in practice. And several examples of this, right? We might think of how meritocracy picks the most able students, but then produces, in reality, produces a technocratic kind of leadership that is deficient in in the usual ways, right? Where we think about technocracy, that it is people who come from the same background, who are rewarded for the same kinds of meritorious qualities, very narrow range of qualities. And so they're very similar. They think in the same way. And when they think in the same way too much, then you're going to get blind spots, and you're going to get an attitude to blind spots, right? Which is that either you genuinely cannot see what's in the blind spot, or you know that there are blind spots, but you make a calculation that let's ignore them, because if something bad happens, we can afford the cost of dealing with problems that come up in the blind spot. So you have that sort of situation. And then in times of crisis, such as a pandemic, you see lots and lots of mistakes because of the narrowness of this technocratic elite. Criticism often also points to how leadership of this kind suffers from a number of deficits, including imagination, empathy, courage, and so on. So that's one set of criticisms. Another has to do with the knowledge-based economy, what we used to describe as the knowledge-based economy in the 1990s, 2000s. And the question that's often asked today in the context of why it is we're so dependent on foreign talent in Singapore is, why is it that we can't supply our own talent from within the system if our education system is so good and universities are ranked so highly? Why is it that we keep saying that we don't have talented enough Singaporeans to fill these jobs in the new higher end economy? The answers that are provided to this question are often quite unsatisfactory. But one type of answer that criticism of meritocracy suggests is that and it's related to this notion of scarcity and competition, right? When you only pay attention to the small number of winners, then a whole bunch of capable people who could otherwise fill spaces in this new elevated economy, that whole bunch of people will be demoralized, devalued, and they will stop trying, right? They will stop trying and they'll be considered losers and so on and so forth. Meanwhile, you have this gap in the new economy that you cannot fill. And the pragmatic approach to gaps like that is not to nurture in Singapore, but to fill as instantly as you can. And so to fill those gaps means to rely on the importation of foreign talent immediately. It might also say something about merit, right? That our sorting mechanism is not identifying the right kind of qualities that the new economy needs. So it's a problem with how merit is defined in Singapore's meritocracies. It's kind of, the winners are not the right kind of winners for the new economy, that sort of problem. Then I won't go into it too much, but there are other issues, right? So we think of the design as, one that sustains social mobility, but then in reality, we see rising inequality of many kinds. We see that sense of social immobility, whether it's in the data, the Gini coefficient, or whether it's in this lived experience that people have, right, of their prospects in an expensive place like Singapore. You see also the contradiction between the notion of competitiveness, the value of competitiveness, but then a political system that is utterly uncompetitive, where a party dominates over so many decades. And then it becomes very obvious to citizens why that is the case, because of the advantages of incumbency, because of the manipulation of the rules of the game, all legal, but still manipulative of the rules of the game, the bullying that the incumbent party practices against its opponents, and so on. And so it's that sort of problem, right? The design is great, but what appears in practice is far from desirable. So here's the fourth one, meritocracy as ideology. And you could think of this in the most benign way, right? That ideology is simply a codification of who we are, how we do things, right? So we could think of meritocracy as going into the explanation of what Singapore is, how it's become the way that it has. It's a kind of self-knowing for Singaporeans. But you could also think of it as an externalization of identity, a sort of branding exercise, what you want external stakeholders to think about Singapore. You could think of this also as an exercise in soft power. What makes Singapore attractive to the outside world, right? For commercial reasons, for reasons of foreign affairs, and so on. You can leverage on the imagery and the branding and the narrative of Singapore in order to exercise influence that is disproportionate to Singapore's small size. So it's that sort of idea of meritocracy as ideology. Also, you could think of it as meritocracy as a kind of shared narrative, that you want people to connect to something bigger than themselves, some inspiring story, some sense of who they are and how they got this way and where they can go and so on. So the meritocracy has appeared, I think, in very pronounced ways in the Singapore story and the narratives that we tell ourselves to give ourselves a sense of who we are and to recruit individuals as Singapore subjects, right, with a common story. Then you get into the nastier aspects of ideology, which is has to do with ideology as a kind of, I guess, false consciousness, right? Kind of obfuscation, the hiding of inequalities, of injustices, of exploitation, of domination that goes on, but made palatable because of the desirable language of meritocracy, the fantasy that makes the hardship of life tolerable. It might be ideological in the way that it is used by the powerful in order to legitimize its power and its position in power and to command loyalty. But also, I think, apart from just the ideational, psychic, psychological, there's also the physical sense in which meritocracy can be a way of dividing people, right? By making life about competition, about looking at other people as your rivals for very scarce reward and resources. It isolates people, it alienates people, it prevents people from developing a class consciousness, a sense of collectivity, moral solidarity, uniting, right, to correct an injustice in society. It goes against that because it divides people. Also very physically, what it can do is to simply tire out people. It's exhausting to live in a meritocracy because all you do is work. And very often you are not rewarded with success in a meritocracy that's harshly, which is a harsh sorting system. Right? There are very few that are regarded as successful in a meritocracy of this kind. So you work and you're exhausted and you work long hours and whatever time that you have is spent to kind of resuscitate for the next day, right? So there's very little for anything beyond the nastiness of life. And also meritocracy allows the elite to co-opt, because if you see a potential opponent, what you can do is flatter them with upward mobility and inclusion into the elite circles, right? So there's also that way in which meritocracy is ideological. And finally, meritocracy as decay, right? And the way I sort of deal with this is to think of it as working well in the context of, in the historical context of the survivalist developmental stage, where first of all, ideological diversity was very quickly diminished through political brutality. So people sort of all occupied a much narrower ideological space after the struggles. And the notion of needing to develop very quickly almost demanded a certain kind of leadership. So the idea of what goals were to be pursued by Singapore and what sort of leaders you needed and what sort of qualities they should have as leaders were a lot easier to agree on at that time. And as a result, I suppose meritocracy was a lot easier to play out, right, and to succeed. So, and you also saw social mobility in a very real way. People within 1 or 2 generations moving out of a sort of working class existence into a middle class type of life. So it played very well within that type of historical period. But then in the neoliberal stage in the 1990s, when market logic comes to dominate the thinking and the structuring of policy decisions and the justification of them, and economic globalization meant the opening up of the borders, not only to trade and investment, but also to labor, migrants, foreign talent, and so on and so forth. You get a modulation of meritocracy towards the principles on the right? And the response to that, and this is the something that's more recent, right? The response to that is what I think looks like the beginnings of authoritarian populism. And this is what I mean by that. This is how I see the tension that has emerged in more recent years. So you have neoliberal globalization forming a particular kind of elite, right? An elite consisting of something like a partnership between authoritarian technocrats and a global capital, right? The corporates, the super rich who are all coming to Singapore in the next few years, foreign talent who are described as absolutely necessary because Singapore has no talent of its own. That partnership, right, which has also kind of made Singaporeans who feel left behind, a much more pronounced category. And this has something to do, of course, with rising inequality, the devaluation of the local, and so on and so forth. It gives that sense of being left behind, right? And when that grows, when that category of people and that structure of emotion grows, the ground becomes quite fertile for political manipulation. And this is where the demagogue comes in, right? Charismatic leaders who see an opportunity, disgruntled citizens who may not have a language yet to express their disgruntlement or don't yet have organic leadership to do something about it. Well, this is the opportunity, right, to come in, galvanize this sense of being betrayed by their own leaders, redirect it towards that technocratic elite, but also, as is often the case, to mobilize these hostilities and angry energies on the ground towards scapegoats like migrant workers, like minoritized communities, ethnic minorities, LGBT, the millennial generation, whatever, right? Anything that you identify, groups of people you identify in society as being the potential threat to Singapore's way of living, right? So there's a politics of mobilization directed often at minoritized groups, directed against an elite, unfeeling, arrogant leadership. Interestingly, this often takes the form of moral panics, right? Where people galvanize around particular groups that are very sharply and in a very volatile way identified as the problem of society. Right? And if you didn't deal with this, society would fall apart. The interesting thing about moral panics is it actually feeds into a politics of distraction. So when you have people worry collectively about migrants, or worry collectively about racial minorities, or worry collectively about LGBT, it takes the attention away from the systemic problems of capitalism, right? It's a politics, I argue, of distraction. And meanwhile, while the ground is fertile for authoritarian populism of this kind, we also see authoritarian technocrats muscle up in terms of the repressive instruments that are available to them to silence criticism, to monopolize the truth, to scapegoat its opponents. So that's, I think, sort of how the situation in Singapore is falling into place. And one way that I want to deal with this issue is to think of it in terms of the beginnings of decadence. Right? And I find the work of Ross Douthat's The Decadent Society, a recent book, quite useful in this regard. And I will very likely use it to scaffold my own thinking about Singapore's decadence. He writes about the US. And like the US, I think Singapore has reached a very high level of material prosperity and technological achievement. And at that level, right, in Singapore's case especially, because it was achieved at this breakneck speed, right? There's this very accelerated experience of development. Everyone's exhausted at the pinnacle of achievement, at this peak. And in this exhaustion, we see a kind of economic stagnation, the inability to imagine future economy. So even when we had a committee to imagine the future of the economy, it came up with a very forgettable set of recommendations. It was almost like stringing together the greatest hits of Singapore's past economy, right? So it's become a lot like that, right? It's a reliance on the formulas of the past and a celebration of the formulas of the past, and an inability to imagine anything different or to even celebrate the possibility of doing that. We're seeing institutional decay. We're seeing, even in the cultural, intellectual space, a kind of tiredness, right? Where criticisms tend to be the same and kind of tend to be rehearsed over and over again, and we don't seem to be able to transcend so well. So at that stage, we're seeing stagnation. The economy, society, culture doesn't seem to be able to progress. We're seeing sterility, and as I said earlier, even at the most literal biological sense of it, we are unable to reproduce ourselves. What more, reproduce ideas, aspects of our culture that are valuable. There's sclerosis in the sense of divisions which look more like gridlock. And we don't seem to be able to transcend these divisions or find a language to overcome. And you see this mirrored, I suppose, in the culture wars of the US. As a result of this, we keep having to deal with eternal repetition, right? The question comes up all the time, and the answers are always the same. The criticism is levied all the time, but the response is always the same. And as we keep having to deal with eternal repetition, we become numb, politically, culturally, morally, aesthetically. And I think that's kind of where we're headed if nothing changes in Singapore. And it's kind of a story of how Singapore is a victim of its own very, very significant success. And so finally, what should we do, right? What is to be done? So one type of approach is to say, and this is a very typical Singapore approach, right? Which is, if it ain't broke, then don't even try to fix it. Like let it run its course until the machine no longer works, and then we look for a new machine. Or we could say, let's maybe remove those parts that we could all agree are harmful, or maybe replace them. Or we could say, well, if we like the machine, let's clean it up, let's lubricate it, let's reboot it, and let it work again. Or we might say, okay, let's pay more attention to the environmental conditions in which the machine is trying to operate, right? And the environment might have changed, or the people operating machines might have changed. So let's pay more attention to those things. Or we could say, maybe this machine is no longer relevant. Meritocracy is no longer relevant, and we need to reinvent how we think about society, how we think about leadership, how we think about even talent. Or we might say, maybe we don't need a way of sorting talent out. Maybe we should simply destroy the machine. So I have no answer at all to this question, and it's the question that will, I suppose, exercise my thinking as I write this book. So maybe I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Plenty of time for questions, both in the room and in the virtual space. Participants can send their questions by chat, I guess. Okay, so shall we start that way? Shall we have a look at some of the chat questions first?
Okay.
Or would you prefer to have? There aren't any. Sorry.
No, yeah, they're just.
So while we're gathering our thoughts, sorry, are there any questions in the audience? While we're gathering our thoughts, and can people hear me when I'm standing here?
Yes.
Okay, thanks. For those of you listening virtually, please type in your questions. We'll deal with them. But in the meantime, two questions, Kenneth, just to kick things off. First is the question of authoritarian populism. And I mean, that's an interesting idea, but I just couldn't quite make a sort of actual political association. So if you could perhaps, for non-experts, clue us in a bit to where you see that threat emerging, or what kind of political constellations that do currently or may soon involve. The second question I can't resist asking, having just done a review of the book, Ben Watt's Liberalism Disavowed. And he pushes, of course, the point that we shouldn't forget about Singapore's socialist tradition, however distant that may seem at the moment. I'm just wondering how perhaps maybe you might want to comment on that thesis, but also how that would fit into this discussion of meritocracy. Is that sort of a parallel tradition to meritocracy that's kind of lost steam, or is it? I mean, because obviously the idea of housing policy and every Singaporean, not every, but compared to Hong Kong certainly, very high percentage of Singaporeans having access to public housing, being the signature program of that socialist aspect of Singapore's development.
Great. Thanks for those two questions. So the question about authoritarian populism, broadly speaking, I see it as a response from the ground, right, towards the excesses of a technocratic elite that doesn't seem to be, at least from their point of view, doesn't seem to be paying enough attention to the problems on the ground that ordinary people in Singapore face. So there is this image of Singapore, very often externally directed, of that incredibly successful city that a lot of people want to mimic in some way or other, an example, an exemplar of success, and it's externally directed. But the sense that a lot of people on the inside have contradicts that very much. And I guess partly it's that feeling of inequality in Singapore, right? So when you look at the Gini coefficient, for example, it may not seem so bad, right? Singapore is in the 0.4243, and the OECD average is about 0.3233, something like this, right? So it's not terrible, and the numbers themselves, especially after government transfers, don't seem to be getting worse. They seem to be improving. So from that angle, the data would suggest it's not necessarily getting worse. But that's the problem, I think, which is that when elites and technocratic elites talk about a thing like inequality, they tend to resort to data. They tend to resort to numbers. And they tend to do it in a way that seems to trivialize the lived experience of ordinary people. It's almost like saying, okay, so you are saying you're having a hard time coping with life. But the numbers here show that you're not. You're actually not, it's not that bad, right? And that can be a terrible thing for a person to hear, right? Can be a terrible thing for a person to hear, especially in a time like this with COVID, pandemic, and so on. People are really struggling. And then to hear that expressed in that way. At the same time, in the last 10 years, 15 years, Singapore's again, a city, right? It's a very dense city. So when we think about inequality, you're thinking about an experience of difference within a very congested space. Across the street from where you are is multi-million-dollar housing. On the roads, you'll find, and I think this is documented, right? Singapore is among the highest rates of luxury cars per road space. So you'll see all this, and meanwhile you're told to go car lights, right? To take public transport. And there was a time not too long ago when the public transport broke down very often. And one of the reasons for that was in the 90s, 2000s, not enough, there were not enough investments into the infrastructure. There was too much focus on the retail aspects of the infrastructure and all of that. So again, the capitalistic orientation. So, the experience of the ordinary person in Singapore is different from what the numbers might suggest. It's different from the image that represents Singapore globally. And then to be told that, you should be thankful for how things are in Singapore, I think it grates very badly. So when enough people feel this way, they need to channel this frustration somewhere, right? And the authoritarian populism part of it comes in with, I suppose, the political opportunities that present themselves. When you have angry, frustrated people who don't know where to express this frustration, and because meritocracy has divided everyone into competing individuals, it's kind of just festering. And these are the conditions in which a demagogue can very easily come in, play with latent xenophobia and racism in order to maximize their own political capital and gain politically. And this can come from the political opposition as well as the political establishment. So I'm seeing the beginnings of this. Now, Singapore is very careful because we have a long tradition of multiracialism, and we're very cautious about racism and such things, right? So because we're so careful about racism and all of that, one consequence of that is that we bury a lot of the uncertainties and the fear of otherness in the collective unconscious, right? And that's dangerous because it's kind of subterranean, right? And all it takes is for some episode with a racial element to come about, a demagogue to capitalize on that, and you're going to get the kind of a right situation. So to me, the populism is like this, right? Specific to Singapore, and it's divisive. And as a result of it being divisive like this, and in some sense irreconcilable, you're not going to get a revolutionary change. You're not going to get the kind of reform that's necessary to rebalance Singapore's obsession with the orthodoxies of neoliberal globalization. Instead, you get parties, holding on to their positions in tighter and tighter ways, and that's sclerotic to me. So it's either going to be decadent, or it's going to be politically inflammatory. The socialist legacy, I think, is all but lost. I don't even think it's spoken about officially. The feeling, even in space in the islands of socialism that we still see, such as public housing and health and all that, is still discussed in terms, well, it's universal, available to all, but it's discussed in terms of how do you make the process efficient, right? The concern is about the administering of these services. How do you minimize cost? How do you ensure that people are responsible when they use these services, right? Co-payments. How do you ensure that people don't abuse the system? Right? It's a very pessimistic view of human nature as kind of exploiting and abusing whatever public good is available to them. So I think a lot of that is in official thinking, at least, it's gone. The education of a lot of our political leaders also doesn't include that socialist tradition. And then the voices within the system who are more progressive and who I think must have tried along the way to make a change have been smothered. Oh, wow. Okay. How should I do this, Mark?
That's a good question. This is maybe scroll up and go. The question is right left is
which one is that?
that's
right at the top?
no, it's further down.
Could you share your views on an assertion that Singapore's meritocratic approach has actually been a failure because at the international level, in the arts, literature, culture, business, etc., Singaporeans in Singapore entities are non-existent or negligible. In comparison, poorer countries have done better. I see. So I'm not sure if that claim is entirely correct, right? In the sense that in the arts, for example, I think many Singaporeans have made a mark internationally. Our films do well in international competitions and festivals. But I would say that because of the way we are with our meritocracy in Singapore and what we choose to value in Singapore, it often means that people like artists have to first make their mark outside of Singapore before they could even be recognized within Singapore. Then, so that's often you know, an unfortunate tactic that our artists have to adopt, which is to find affirmation and accreditation and success in the international circles before Singapore would even pay any attention to them. And there have been, well, not exactly like this, but similar to this. In the past, there have been lots of really talented Singapore musicians who either found it impossible to make a living in Singapore and have had to go overseas, or they were not allowed to pursue international opportunities because of such things as national service. So they missed international opportunities, and so they gave up the national service but went abroad. So I'm thinking of you know, pianists like Melvin Tan or Margaret Ling Tan, and all these are, now she's interesting because she was the very first the very first woman in the world to do a PhD at Juilliard, and she was from Singapore. So you got all these success stories of Singaporeans, but success stories that in a way also point to an internal tragedy, right? That we don't appreciate our own. We look at our own always as second class, and our own can only achieve affirmation outside. So here's a third kind of example. So you have the first example of people who cannot, you know, find no opportunities in Singapore. The second example of people who tactically get international accreditation so that they can do well in Singapore. And then the third kind, which is the censoriousness of Singapore. And I'm thinking of Sunny Liu as an example, right? Who wrote an incredibly incredible graphic novel, which had this support, the financial support of the Singapore National Arts Council, but it was critical. And when they found it to be too critical, they pulled the funding of that project very, you know, very shortly before I think the project was to be launched. So they went ahead with that project without Singapore funding, and that project won the what's equivalent to the Oscars of graphic novels in the world, right? So you've got a Singaporean who's produced this work of art that the Arts Council disavowed and pulled funding out of, and that went on to win the top award in the world for graphic novels. Right? So you got that sort of story as well, where not only do we ignore the success stories in Singapore, we also sometimes clamp down on them when they're politically unpalatable, and then the rest of the world appreciates it for what it is. And maybe I should say a fourth example, which is the response of the establishment to Singaporeans who, without Singapore's help, go overseas, succeed, and then come back, and then the establishment sort of take some credit for their success. I'm thinking of the swimmer Joseph Schooling, right, who got hardly any support from Singapore, but then on his own, with his parents' money, went to train overseas, and then won an Olympic gold. And when he came back with that gold, my goodness, you know, those months, everybody wanted a selfie with him, right? So it's that sort of situation that I think we're in, and it says something about our notion of meritocracy, right? Very narrow. We don't necessarily pay enough attention to cultivating our own. We want to bask in the glory of success, even if that success has absolutely nothing to do with Singapore. And that's at one level a shame, but at another level, it's also a waste of the talent that we actually have in Singapore. We focus too much on a narrow elite, and everyone else who is totally capable um, able to contribute in so many ways to Singapore, we consign to another category altogether, and we demotivate, we demoralize, and we chase out people from our system. And then we say we lack talent, and so we need foreign talent. And that seems to be a thoroughly irrational part of our system. Okay. Must meritocracy inevitably lead to elitism and inequality? Could you share an example of a meritocratic system that serves the interests of the masses without the side effects that you shared earlier? I'm tempted to think that in practice, it almost inevitably leads to elitism and inequality. I think you would have to work really hard and self-consciously to prevent that from happening in the system. And I say this because, you know, the dynamic of winners doing their very best to continue winning in a system that's supposed to be socially mobile, right? A socially mobile system means that people at the bottom can rise to the top when they do well, but people at the top, if they don't continue to do well, have to make way for others, right? So that's a very scary prospect for people who have won in the first race. So they want to ensure that the second race, the third race, and so on, and then the race for their next generation and so on and so forth will be won by them. So there's a very strong incentive for the winners to keep, you know, kind of designing and redesigning the system to mirror victory and winners in their own image, you know, and that kind of over time, the advantages that you have from your position, your elite position, translates into, you know, the advantages at the start of the next game, right? And that just gets bigger and bigger, the advantage. And if nothing is done, and if you have a very underdeveloped welfare system to redistribute resources, wealth taxes and things like that, then you're going to have that problem, right? Where the rich will get richer. The rich will want to get richer unless there is something built into the system that militates against that. So there's that aspect. There's also the sense in which an essential part of meritocracy is competitiveness. So I've sometimes wondered, could you reward collaborativeness through a competitive system, right? Could you genuinely say that we want the best at the top, but we want the best to have these qualities like collaboration, empathy for others, a sense of community, a sense of moral responsibility. And as much as I want to think it's possible, I think when it rolls out in practice, it's virtually impossible, right, to achieve. So it seems to me, in answer to your question, the short answer to your question is, if you don't purposefully and purposely design into the system particular cadences when you redistribute, or particular features in the system that are attentive to excessive inequalities and so on and so forth, then you will almost inevitably move to elitism and inequality. Those at the bottom will feel left out, they'll feel disgruntled, disenchanted, even envious, and those at the top will be totally disgusted by the rest, right? If only they could try, look at me, you know, I came from a humble starting point, which is always the story, right? So whenever politicians roll out their new candidates, the narrative that all of them give about their life story is that they started from humble beginnings. Sometimes people think this is like a false way to make a connection with ordinary people, but that's not the point. The narrative of starting from humble beginnings is a narrative about how in Singapore you can rise up the ranks. Right? Social mobility is possible and real, and they are the example of that. It's very important for them to demonstrate that everybody can do this because it legitimizes the system, but it also trivializes the very real inequalities and disadvantages that many in the system face. So I think, really you have to design the system to really work against it, or else elitism is the inevitable outcome.
Perhaps you can ask the questions here, please.
Yeah,
Hi.
I'm sorry if it's a bit of a shift from the
Sure, yeah.
questions, but yeah, I was just wondering, like coming from like a ground up civil society, like I guess like mindset, like because I think the theme is more of like how like a strong interventionist state, come influences and create like this society where elitism and inequality exist. So I'm just like wondering whether there could be like a solution that could involve like a more grown up civil society that could possibly shift the system.
Okay. Can people in Zoom land hear the question? Is that?
Maybe you can repeat it. And
okay.
Actually, Kenneth, you can also
move
the chat because I think it's covering you.
Oh, I see. Right. Okay.
So people.
That might be a good thing. Anyway, okay. So here I am. Yeah. Okay. The question was, could if systemically and from a sort of top-down perspective, the system is hard to change, could there be the possibility of change from a ground-up perspective, or can civil society, for example, play a role in this change? And yes, of course. In fact, I would even, I would not discount the possibility of progressive elements within the system, continuing to have the idealism to try to change things, even within the civil service. And, there are obviously people who are much more progressive, who are thoughtful about things, who wish they had the opportunity and the voice and the capacity and the solidarity to make a change in the system from within it, right? I'm sure there are plenty of people and they struggle every day, intellectually, politically, when they think about their career and the prospect, and they have to balance this idea of, for me to have enough of a voice to make a change from within the system, I need to progress within that system. So it's like, how much do you buy into the system in order to gain capital to make a change? And in reality, many of them just get too tired out after a time, or the system that they try to do well in order to make a change from inside becomes them, right? So they start to embrace that system, and then they lose the incentive to change. So, but I will still say there are change makers and potential revolutionaries within the system. It's just that they struggle a great deal. What's the outside like? So civil society is obviously a very, very heterogeneous space. There are aspects of civil society, there are people in civil society who are defined by the state as bad civil society activists, right? These are the ones that, they pay a lot of attention to, and the ones they try to muzzle, the ones they try to control. And they have very little space in that sense, right? So they have the capacity, they certainly have the capacity, they've learned a whole repertoire of civil society activists, techniques and methods. There's a certain kind of compassion in that group. So they think about looking after one another, they think about solidarity, they think about, they are very aware of how easily you can burn out in civil society. You can fight for a cause, and then you realize that almost nobody's supporting you. You're alone out there, but you only have your comrades, right? So I think it's a very mature group of people. They are battle hardened, they are intelligent, they are articulate, and that's probably why the state is so careful about them, right? So there's that space. And then you have another sort of space, I guess, of change makers within civil society, young people mostly, a lot of university students who want to make change, but they don't want to get involved in all the political mess that sometimes entails, right? So they do this in the most apolitical way possible, and in that sense, right, you might think of them as very, very pragmatic. They will work with people from the establishment. They will work with people who are outside the establishment just to pursue a cause, make a change that they feel strongly for, and they will very pragmatically avoid what in Singapore are called the OB markers, right? The out of bound markers, and they become very skilled at doing this, a very high EQ and so on and so forth. And many of this also do this. Many of them also do this to make a change, but also to advance their careers, right? I mean, they want to succeed in life and so on and so forth, and having the experience of activism is also something that looks nice on a CV. So in that sense, I guess your question is, can change happen on the ground? Well, there's parts of civil society that are very offensive to the state, and if change happens there, it's often a very grating kind of change. The wins are very small, and the losses are very very spectacular, right? And then you have groups that take civil society activism as part of their career development. They can do well in life, in their careers, in civil society, and so on and so forth. And they might also be motivated by the same meritocratic principles of success, competitiveness. So sometimes we think of civil society as in a very romanticized way, right? It's people who are selfless and they're in that space just to do good. But of course, the reality is they're also competing in that space, and there are different groups that compete for prestige, recognition, success, and there are individuals within groups who compete amongst each other for position, for leadership. So I think it's probably useful not to over-romanticize civil society and recognize that it's as susceptible as anything else to some of the most egregious aspects of meritocracy.
We have a few more minutes. Toby?
Presentation. So I just in terms of how you framed it, and I think it's more just something to think about. So in envisaging meritocracy as a machine, there's sort of a danger that we lose sight of the interests, the winners and the losers, that are sort of inevitably bundled up in what meritocracy entails in practice. And the second question I was going to ask is, to what extent, is meritocracy really about sort of a set of ideas and practices that in many ways are sort of fundamentally developed to inhibit political participation, and therefore they sort of have these built-in characteristics that are fundamentally prone to, in some ways, cultivating the seeds of their own demise. I mean, they're sort of tone deaf to the complaints of people, and that's, I guess, creating these limited forms of participation in which people can feed back concerns and difficulties and so forth. A lot of these systems are sort of very much really, when I look at it, they're really about controlling participation and limiting or narrowing the scope for political input from a broad section of people. So in many ways, meritocracy is, especially as it's been applied in Singapore, it's kind of fundamentally, it is elitist, but it's also setting up really quite rapidly or quite easily the seeds for its own demise in terms of not expected from a broad, not because it's giving those safety valves that can release them.
Absolutely, yeah. No, I really agree with those 2 points, especially the second one. And I guess there's many seeds of meritocracy's destruction, and that's one of them, right? Which is the notion, somewhat self-congratulatory notion, that this is an elite that knows better than everyone else, and there's a kind of self-flattery that goes on within that circle, right? And it expresses itself in terms of the reward structures, but it also expresses itself in terms of for the good of Singapore, right? And this is where the first point, right? The losers get wrapped into this machinery. I think that machinery analogy still works. The machine wraps them into this this situation where they come to accept that indeed, these are people who know better than I do. If the machinery works, these are people who know better than I do, because they are much more qualified than I am, and because they've gone through a very stringent process of selection. So they must be better than I am. And at some level, I suppose it's hard to argue with I would, if I had to be ruled by someone else, I would like for that person to be better than me. Right? So it's difficult to argue against that premise. So if and again, the machine has produced good results. Singapore is a success story, right? In many respects in the past, especially if you look at very specific things, you can say Singapore is a very successful story. And if that successful story is held up all the time as evidence of how this meritocracy works, then if you were a failure in the system, you would still say, this is still the society I would like to live in because I'm ruled by people who are better than. Okay, so that's when it's stable, right? But as you say, the seeds of its destruction happens when mistakes are more and more made. And absolutely, and people see this, right? And people can see this, and social media allows people to talk about the mistakes and have a language for expressing these mistakes, and to make the connection between these mistakes and the limitations of groupthink, the limitations of people from very similar backgrounds who are elevated and rewarded in a certain kind of way, unable to connect with the realities on the ground, unable to, in fact, almost willfully dismissing views that may be sensible, but dismissing them simply because they come from people who might be seen as political opponents, not including obvious talent within the center just because they don't belong to the right party, for example. I mean, that's obviously going to lead to decay and decline, whether the elite like it or not, right? So I think that's going to be a very big part of my story as well, meaning the book story, right? That this narrowing down of the elite, their overconfidence, the exclusionary aspect of this, those are your starting points of decay.
If I may, given that we don't have much time, I've just been looking at the chat. Two questions, perhaps, and then we can finish up toward the bottom. One is about associating. This is the bottom associating.
Which one are you looking at?
The second to the bottom, the third to the bottom.
National Pledge.
The one above that is about authoritarian populism and whether the PAP can be associated with that. We talked about that earlier.
Can be associated. Okay, yeah.
Question. And then did you say the one below that about the National Pledge, where meritocracy is not mentioned? Perhaps if
that's not anything that's fair. I see. Okay.
Yeah, those two.
Yeah.
And then we should finish up with that.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So authoritarian. Yeah. So actually, in the subtitle of this proposed book that I'm working on is what I'm kind of clumsily at this time calling neoliberal populism. And that sort of takes into account, I think, what you're pointing to, which is usually when you think of authoritarian populism, you think of populist parties and sort of fringe parties that gain ascendancy because they know how to tap into the fears, the xenophobic fears and the racism of people. But we also see that in the Singapore case, that the establishment itself is not immune to authoritarian populist behavior, right? Except they're much more careful, and I think they have more confidence that they're able to control this monster. But I want to try and see if I can think of it not so much as authoritarian populism as a dialectical response to neoliberal globalization, but to see if some kind of hybrid thing is happening in Singapore where the neoliberal part takes on authoritarian populist dimensions too, and if I could call that something like neoliberal populism. So I guess my answer is I'm thinking about that very carefully, but I don't have the answer to it yet. So whether meritocracy, since meritocracy isn't part of the pledge, should we turn to the values of the pledge? Whenever the pledge is raised, I remember Lee Kuan Yew what did he say? The pledge is simply aspirational, right? When it was raised in Parliament as something that we should take seriously, I think his response to that was if you talk this way, it's very highfalutin. The pledge is meant to simply be aspirational and so on. So I'm not so sure what place the pledge actually has, what roots it has in the sort of popular imagination of Singaporeans. I mean, it's something that school children say every morning. Most of us hear once a year at National Day, together with the anthem and so on. And there's a ritual, symbolic value in the pledge. But I'm not so sure if people think very deeply about what the ideas expressed in that pledge really what they are in the first place, and what they refer to and what they imply if we were to take them seriously. Happiness, prosperity, progress, equality, democracy, these sorts of things, at one level, I suppose they are general enough and ambiguous enough for them to mean anything you like them to mean. At another level, they seem to be almost anachronistic, right? Like things that, a more classical approach to political philosophy might have considered practical, but in the sort of pragmatic world that we live in today, seem to almost be pious language, right? That is nice to say, but very difficult and problematic, troublesome to effect or implement. So I guess that's maybe my.
Thank you very, very much, Kenneth.
Thank you so much.
Thank you to the audience, both here and afar, and apologies to those chapters who we didn't get to. We'll be working on our hybrid methodology.
It's a work in progress.
But anyway, thank you for being involved in this great experiment. Our first hybrid lecture circuit will continue to do as long as the pandemic is here. Thanks again. Thank you.
Thank you. It's my pleasure. Thank you.